You measured your conversion rate last month and it came out to 4%. You write that number into your plan, 4.0%, and you start making decisions as if it were carved in stone. But that single tidy number is quietly lying to you. The truth was never exactly 4%. The truth was somewhere in a range around 4%, and how wide that range is depends on how little data you actually had. Today I want to talk about confidence intervals, the honest way to show a number as a range instead of a single false point. Because once you see it, you stop trusting the false precision sitting all over your own dashboard. I am not a statistician. I am someone who runs small businesses and has been burned by a single confident number more than once. I have quoted a 4% rate to myself, planned a whole month of spending around it, and then watched the real figure wander 2 points either side as more data came in. So this is not a lecture on formulas, it is the habit I now use to keep myself honest, and it needs nothing more than the counts you already have. What a confidence interval actually is. A confidence interval is a range you put around a measured number to show how uncertain it is. Instead of saying your conversion rate is 4%, you say it is somewhere between 3 and 5%, and you attach a confidence level, usually 95%, that describes how careful that range is. The single number in the middle is your best guess, the point estimate. The range around it is your honesty about how much that guess could wobble. One is a bare claim, the other is a claim with its uncertainty attached, and only the second one is telling you the whole truth. Why a single number is a small lie. When you report a plain 4%, you are pretending to a precision you never had. Your measured rate is just one draw from a noisy process, one sample of customers who happen to show up this month. Run the same month again with different people, and you would get a slightly different number. Writing 4.0% with that confident decimal place hides all of that movement behind a mask of exactness. False precision is one of the most common ways a small operator fools himself, because a number that looks sharp feels more trustworthy than a range, even when the range is the honest answer. The width of the interval has a friendlier name you already know from the news, the margin of error. It is the plus or minus part. 4%, give or take 1 point, is a range of 3 to 5. When a poll says a candidate is on 40% with a margin of error of 3 points, they are telling you the real figure could sensibly sit anywhere from 37 to 43. Your business numbers deserve exactly the same treatment. Every rate you quote to yourself has a plus or minus hiding behind it, and the smaller your sample, the bigger that plus or minus quietly is. What the 95% actually means. The confidence level is the part almost everyone gets slightly wrong, so let me say it carefully. A 95% confidence interval does not mean there is a 95% chance the truth sits inside this particular range. It means the method is reliable most of the time. If you repeated your measurement over and over and built one of these ranges each time, about 95 out of every 100 of those ranges would capture the real value and a handful would miss it completely. You never know whether today handed you one of the reliable ranges or one of the rare misses, and that honest wobble is the whole point. What makes the range wide or narrow? 3 things set the width of a confidence interval. The first is your sample size, and it is the big one, because more data pulls the 2 edges of the range in tight around the middle. The second is how confident you insist on being, since demanding 99% confidence instead of 95 forces the range wider to stay safe. The third is how spread out your underlying data is, because messy variable numbers leave more room for doubt than tidy consistent ones. Of those 3, sample size is the lever you can actually pull, which is why the range and the amount of data are really the same story told twice. The width shrinks slowly. If you remember the last thing I said about sample size, this will sound familiar, because the range narrows with the square root of your data, not in step with it. To make your interval half as wide, you need 4 times as many events, not twice. To make it a third as wide, you need 9 times as many. That is why a solo business hits a wall so fast. The jump from 50 events to 200 tightens the range beautifully, but past the point, every extra scrap of certainty costs an enormous pile of new data you simply do not have. A founder-sized example. Let me make it concrete, and please treat these as illustration, not benchmarks to copy. Say 1,000 people reached your checkout and 40 of them bought, a neat 4%. The honest range around that, at 95% confidence, lands roughly between 3 and 5%, Now imagine you only had 100 visitors and 4 sales, still 4% on the surface, but the honest range balloons out to something like 1 to 10%. Same headline rate, wildly different confidence, and only the raw counts underneath tell you which 4% you are really holding. Rensaf reshines Adam. When you first start attaching these ranges to your own numbers, they will look embarrassingly wide, and your instinct will be to hide them. Resist that. As a meeting is not the method failing, it is the method being honest about a thin pile of data. The alternative, quoting a crisp single number you have not earned, does not make the uncertainty go away. It just buries it until it ambushes you later. I would far rather know my rate is somewhere between 2 and 6% than believe a false 4 and build a whole plan on sand. Overlapping ranges cannot crown a winner. This is where confidence intervals quietly rescue your tests. Say version A converts at 4% and version B at 5%, and you are ready to declare B the champion. Put a range around each of them. If A sits somewhere between 3 and 5, and B sits somewhere between 4 and 6, those two ranges overlap heavily, and that overlap is the intervals telling you the gap could easily be pure noise. You have not found a winner. You have found two numbers still too blurry to separate. Only when the ranges pull clearly apart have you got something worth acting on. Watch for a range that straddles 0. There is a sharper version of that same check when you look straight at the difference between two things. Suppose you measure the lift from a change, and it comes out to a 2-point improvement. Now put a confidence interval on that lift itself. If the range runs from -1 to +5, it straddles 0, which means an outcome of no change at all, or even a small loss, is still firmly on the table. A difference whose honest range includes 0 is not yet a difference you have proven. It is a maybe wearing the costume of a result. What a confidence interval is not. Here is the misread that trips people up most. A confidence interval is a statement about your estimate of the average, not a promise about any single customer. If your average order value is $30 with a range of 28 to 32, that range is about how well you know the average, not a claim that every order will land between 28 and 32. Individual customers will still spend $5 or $300. The interval tightens as you gather data, but the spread of your actual customers does not shrink at all, and confusing those two is a classic and expensive mistake. The average, not the spread. That distinction matters enough to say it twice a different way. One idea describes how much your individual values scatter, and that scatter is a fixed fact of your business that stays put no matter how much data you collect. The confidence interval is a completely different animal. It describes how sure you are about a summary like the average, and it keeps shrinking as your sample grows. Wide scatter paired with tons of data can give you a very tight confidence interval around a very spread out reality. Keep the two ideas in separate drawers and half the confusion around uncertainty simply disappears. Attach the range every time. The practical habit is almost embarrassingly small. Whenever you write down a rate or an average that a real decision hangs on, write the range beside it, even a rough one. Not 4%, but 4% give or take a couple of points. That single extra phrase changes how you think, because it forces you to ask how much data sits underneath before you spend money on the number. A plan built on ranges bends when reality shifts. A plan built on false single points snaps. How to actually work one out. You do not need to derive anything by hand. Most analytics tools and testing platforms will show you a confidence interval or a margin of error if you go looking for the setting, and a spreadsheet can produce one from your counts with a single built-in function. For a rough feel with proportions like a conversion rate, there is a crude shortcut. Take your rate, and the smaller your number of events, the more you should mentally widen it. The fewer your events, the wider you should picture the range. Even a hand-waved range beats a false exact one. Where the details live. Every one of these explainers lives in writing at dataresearchanalysiscollection.com. The whole metric library in plain English, with confidence intervals worked through on a real thin conversion test rather than a tidy textbook one. I keep it honest there for the same reason I keep it honest here. No promises about your results, and no pretending a range removes the risk from a decision. Read it slowly with your own numbers open, and you will start seeing how many of the sharp single figures on your dashboard were only ever a wide blurry range wearing a disguise. The honest limit. Hold the whole idea in proportion. A confidence interval does not shrink your uncertainty, it does not make a thin test trustworthy, and it certainly cannot hand you certainty because nothing can. All it does is show the uncertainty you already had, out in the open where you can see it, instead of hidden inside a confident-looking decimal. That sounds like a small thing, but a number that admits what it does not know is worth 10 numbers that pretend to know everything, and it will quietly save you from more overconfident decisions than any tool you could ever buy. A confidence interval is a range around a measured number with a confidence level like 95% that describes how reliable the method is, not the odds for this one particular range. A single point number is false precision, and the true answer always has a plus or minus attached, whose width is driven mostly by your sample size. Treat wide ranges as honesty rather than failure. Refuse to crown a test winner while the two ranges overlap, and be suspicious of any difference whose range still straddles zero. And remember, the interval is about your estimate of the average, never about where the next customer lands. Next time I want to talk about standard deviation, the number that finally puts a figure on how spread out your data really is. I will see you in the next one.